December 25th, 1944. A freezing morning in Montana. The wind howled through the fences of a German women's prison camp, and the snow bit like knives. The women stood shivering, waiting for orders, until an American guard called out, "No work today, it's Christmas." They didn't move. They thought it was a trick. Then a smell, warm turkey, butter, cinnamon, drifted through the cold air. Could this be real? Kindness from the enemy? What happened next broke every wall inside them and made even the toughest soldiers cry. Stay with me till the end of this story. And if you love true World War II stories of courage and humanity, please subscribe, like this video, and help us keep sharing history that still touches the heart. December 25th, 1944. The sun had not yet risen over the small prisoner camp in Montana. The cold was sharp enough to bite through wool and skin. Inside the wooden barracks, dozens of German women, former nurses, teachers, and factory workers, were already awake. Their breath turned to mist in the freezing air. The smell of damp clothes, soap, and iron bunks filled the room. For 8 months, this had been their world. Every morning, a whistle blew at 5 a.m. They lined up for roll call, wrapped in thin coats, waiting for orders. Some were sent to chop firewood, others cleaned kitchens or washed endless pots in near-freezing water. Their hands were cracked, their lips dry. Most had not received a single letter from home since being captured. For them, Christmas was just another day to survive. But something felt different this morning. The camp was quiet, too quiet. No whistle, no shouts from the guards. Only the sound of boots crunching frost outside and the wind whispering against the tin roof. The women waited, unsure if this was some kind of test. Then, through the cold morning air, came a voice. "No work today, it's Christmas." The guards' words hung there for a moment. A few of the women exchanged confused looks. They didn't understand the English at first. One young woman, a former teacher from Leipzig, translated softly, "Kein Arbeit heute, it's Christmas." No work, Christmas. The words didn't make sense together, not here, not now. These women had learned that mercy was dangerous to believe in. War had taken everything, homes, husbands, brothers, and trust. They waited, frozen in place, half expecting a correction or a cruel joke. But none came. Outside, the sky was the color of dull metal. The air smelled like snow that had not yet fallen. A few women stepped to the doorway, wrapping their blankets around their shoulders. In the distance, the mess hall windows glowed faintly yellow. Someone inside was moving around. The smell reached them, a faint, sweet scent mixed with smoke. It wasn't the usual thin oatmeal. It smelled like butter, like roasted meat. One of the older women, a former factory supervisor from Dusseldorf, frowned. "They must be cooking for themselves," she said quietly. "Not for us." But the young teacher shook her head. Maybe it's for everyone." The others laughed bitterly. "For prisoners? Don't be foolish." And yet, no one went back inside. They stood there in the freezing air, staring at the light, uncertain whether to hope or stay numb. For months they had been machines, working, surviving, never feeling. Now for the first time, something stirred inside them, a question they didn't dare ask aloud. Could this really be for us? In that quiet moment, surrounded by cold and doubt, a strange feeling began to spread, not warmth, not yet, but the memory of what warmth once felt like. But this was only the beginning. The guard stood at the gate, his breath white in the air. He repeated the words again, slower this time. "No work today, Christmas." He pointed toward the mess hall, where yellow light spilled through the frosted windows. The women watched him carefully, waiting for the trick. In war, kindness often came with a price. The teacher translated again for those who didn't understand. Still, no one moved. A few women hugged their thin coats tighter. Their shoes were worn down, the leather cracked from months of snow and gravel. Somewhere behind them, a stove clanked weakly, its fire almost dead. The guard said something else, but the wind carried his words away. Then he turned and walked off, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. The women were left standing in silence. "What if it's true?" one whispered. The older woman from Dusseldorf shook her head. "Don't trust it. Nothing is free." But then another said, "I smell something, something sweet." The others sniffed the air. There it was again, roasting meat, butter, maybe cinnamon. The smell didn't belong in a prison camp. It was the smell of a home kitchen, the kind they hadn't known since before the bombings, before ration cards and hunger. A few women began walking toward the mess hall, slow and cautious. Others followed, still unsure, 15 of them in total, wrapped in mismatched coats and scarves, moving together through the cold. The ground was frozen so hard it rang beneath their boots. As they got closer, the smells grew stronger: roasted turkey, coffee, bread. The mess hall's windows were fogged with heat from inside. They could see shadows moving beyond the glass, Americans carrying trays, setting plates, arranging tables. The women stopped. This couldn't be real. They had seen Americans before, guards who gave orders, soldiers who stared but said little. But this looked like a celebration. One woman whispered, "Maybe it's for them. Maybe they'll eat first and throw us scraps." But then the door opened. A young American sergeant stood there, barely older than 20. His face was red from the cold, his eyebrows pale, his eyes soft and kind. He didn't speak German, but he smiled and waved them in. For a long moment, no one moved. The warmth from the open door reached them, smelling of food, soap, and coffee. Then the young teacher stepped forward first. Slowly, the others followed, one by one. Inside, the light was almost blinding. The hall was bright, every bulb lit. Paper garlands hung along the walls in red and green. Tables were covered in white linen, not the usual oilcloth. Each place had a plate, a fork, and a napkin folded neatly. The women stood frozen by the doorway. They had prepared themselves for punishment, not kindness. And now, standing in front of this impossible scene, they didn't know how to move or speak. This wasn't propaganda, one of them thought. It can't be real, but it was. And what they saw next would break every wall they had built inside themselves. The American soldiers smiled as the German women slowly entered the warm hall. The heat hit their faces, and for the first time in months, they felt something close to comfort. The air was thick with smells: roasted turkey, potatoes, bread, and coffee. Some of the women's eyes filled with tears just from the smell alone. "Please sit," said one of the Americans. He pointed to the tables, trying his best to sound friendly. They didn't understand every word, but they understood his tone. It wasn't harsh. It wasn't the voice of a guard. It was kind. They sat down quietly, unsure what to do. Their hands were trembling, part from cold, part from disbelief. The plates were clean, the knives shiny, the napkins white. These were small things, but after months in a muddy camp, they looked almost magical. Then came the food. One by one, American soldiers carried trays piled high with meat, bread, and vegetables. The smell of butter filled the air. There were even pies, apple, pumpkin, and something that smelled like chocolate. One soldier poured coffee into each cup, saying, "Merry Christmas," with a shy smile. The women looked at each other, waiting for a signal. The teacher whispered, "They mean it. It's not a trick." And then the first woman took a bite. Her lips shook as she chewed. Tears rolled down her cheeks before she could swallow. "It's warm," she whispered. "It's warm." Others followed, carefully at first, then faster, as if afraid someone might take it away. For a few minutes, the hall was silent, except for the sounds of forks and soft sobs. An American officer watched from the corner. In his report later, he wrote, "Some of the women began to cry while eating. They could not understand why they were being treated as guests instead of prisoners." For the Americans, this meal was simple: a holiday break, a small act of decency in a cruel war. But for the German women, it felt like the world had turned upside down. Only months before, they had been told that Americans were monsters, yet here they were, being served by them. One soldier placed a record player on a crate. Music began, soft, crackling through the air. It was Silent Night, the same song the women had sung in their homes long before the war tore their lives apart. Without thinking, a few of them began to hum along in German. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. The Americans fell quiet. Some smiled, some bowed their heads. For a moment, the two sides, enemies only yesterday, were joined by a single song. In that mess hall, there were no borders, no uniforms, no war. Only people, hungry, tired, and human. This wasn't propaganda, the teacher thought again. This was real. But for all its warmth, this moment also carried a strange pain, because kindness can hurt more than cruelty when it reminds you of what you've lost. For a few minutes, the hall stayed filled with quiet sounds, the clink of forks, the soft hum of music, the creak of boots on the wooden floor. The American soldiers stood back, letting the women eat as much as they wanted. No one shouted, no one rushed them. Then, something unexpected happened. One of the women, the youngest, began to cry. Not a small tear, but a deep, shaking cry, the kind that comes from months of fear and hunger. She tried to hide her face, but the tears kept coming. An American soldier noticed and walked over. He didn't know what to say, so he simply took a clean napkin and placed it in front of her. She looked up at him, eyes red and wet, and said softly, "Danke." He didn't understand the word, but he nodded. Soon others began to cry too. Some cried quietly, others openly, heads down on the table. One woman held a piece of bread in her hands and just stared at it. "It's been so long," she whispered. "Real bread." Another woman said, "They are feeding us better than we fed our own prisoners." Her voice was full of shame. A few American soldiers looked away. They weren't used to seeing their enemies like this, not as soldiers, but as women, tired and broken. Private Charles Anderson wrote later in a letter to his wife, "They looked like our own mothers, sisters, wives, only thinner, sadder. I never thought I'd feel sorry for Germans, but today I did." For the women, this moment was too much to understand. They had seen bombings, lost homes, buried family, and yet here they sat. Clean tables, warm food, music playing softly, being treated with dignity. It broke something inside them, but it also began to heal something too. The teacher looked around at the faces of her fellow prisoners. For the first time, they didn't look like enemies or victims. They just looked human again. A nurse among them whispered, Maybe they are not what we were told." Outside, the snow kept falling. The camp's guard towers were still there, their outlines dark against the white fields. But the air inside the hall was different, softer, warmer, filled with the scent of cinnamon and roast turkey. As the meal ended, the Americans brought out small gifts, oranges, chocolate bars, and cigarettes. Each woman received one. Some held the fruit close to their faces, smelling it as if afraid it might disappear. That night, in their barracks, no one could sleep. The smell of the food still lingered on their hands and clothes. One woman whispered, "It felt like a dream." But another answered quietly, "No. Dreams end. This will stay." What happened that day would live in their memories long after the war ended. It was not the food they remembered most. It was the feeling of being seen again as human. The next morning, the camp was quiet again. Work started as usual, guards at their posts, prisoners walking in lines, shovels in hand. But something had changed in the air. The women still wore the same torn coats, the same tired faces, yet their eyes looked different now. There was a softness, a small light of something they hadn't felt in years, hope. During the day, one of the women whispered to another, "Why did they do it? Why feed us like that?" The older one answered, "Because maybe they don't hate us." It was a simple answer, but a shocking one. All their lives, they had been told that Americans were cruel, that they would destroy Germany and its people. Yet these same Americans had given them food, warmth, and even kindness. A few of the prisoners talked quietly while they worked. One said, "When I saw that soldier smiling, I thought of my brother. He was the same age. Maybe he's a prisoner too." Another woman said, "If my son were in their hands, I'd want someone to treat him this way." That afternoon, the teacher wrote a few lines in her small, hidden notebook. "I cannot explain what happened yesterday. They showed us mercy when we deserved none. It makes me feel smaller, but also cleaner somehow." Mercy. It was a word she hadn't written since the war began. In the camp office, the American commander wrote his own report. It said, "No disturbances. German female POWs received Christmas meal as gesture of goodwill. Many cried. Some expressed gratitude. No discipline issues." To him, it was just a note in a file. But to the women, it was something far deeper. The first proof that, even in war, kindness could still exist. That night, when the lights went out, the women shared pieces of chocolate and small bits of bread they had saved. They didn't eat them quickly. They held each bite carefully, like treasure. The nurse said, "This is what peace must feel like." No one answered, but in the darkness, several nodded. Outside, the cold wind howled over the camp fences. The guard towers still stood. The war was still raging far away, and many of their families were still missing. Yet for one brief moment, they had tasted something more powerful than any army: forgiveness. This wasn't propaganda, the teacher thought again. This was real. And it made her wonder, if the enemy could show mercy, what had all this hatred been for? The war was not yet over, but something had shifted inside them. They began to see that even behind enemy lines, humanity was not completely lost. But the story of this Christmas didn't end there, because in the months that followed, what began as one meal would quietly spread across other camps, a ripple of mercy in a sea of war. Word about the Christmas feast spread quickly from camp to camp. Guards, drivers, and translators told the story to others, how American soldiers had shared food with German women prisoners, how they cried at the table, how the hall had fallen silent when Silent Night played. At first, no one believed it. Impossible, some said. No army feeds its enemies. But then letters and reports began to confirm it. The story was true. In a nearby camp, another group of American guards decided to do the same. They didn't have turkey or pie, but they pooled their own rations, cans of beans, bread, and coffee, and served them to their German prisoners on New Year's Eve. It wasn't much, but it carried the same spirit. A sergeant wrote in his diary, "We gave them what little we had. They looked at us like they couldn't understand. One woman said, 'Why?' I told her, 'Because it's the right thing.'" These small acts didn't make headlines. No newspapers reported them. But in those frozen camps, they meant everything. For many of the German women, it was the first time they had seen the enemy's face up close, not behind a gun, but over a table. They began to see that the men they had been told to fear were not monsters. They were young, tired, and human too. One woman later wrote in a Red Cross letter home, "They gave us oranges for Christmas, real oranges. I never thought I would taste one again. The guard smiled when I thanked him. He looked almost embarrassed." The Americans didn't realize how powerful their gesture was. They saw it as a small act of decency, a break from war. But to the prisoners, it felt like the start of peace. Back in Germany, food was still scarce. Cities like Dresden and Hamburg lay in ruins. People stood for hours in bread lines, trading scraps for survival. So when word of these Christmas meals reached them months later, it sounded like a story from another world. Some refused to believe it. The Americans being kind? Impossible. But others held on to the hope that maybe, when the war ended, life could begin again without hate. In one POW camp, an American chaplain told his men, Mercy is not weakness, it's the strongest weapon we have. That night, the snow fell thick and heavy, covering the muddy fields and broken fences. The world was still at war. But beneath that blanket of white, a small seed of peace had been planted, one that would grow quietly, long after the guns went silent. The women didn't know it yet, but some of them would later write about this moment, this strange Christmas, for the rest of their lives. And every time they did, they would say the same thing. That was the day I stopped hating. Months passed. The war finally ended in May 1945. The camps began to empty, one by one. Soldiers packed their things, and prisoners were told they could soon go home. But for the German women who had spent that strange Christmas in the American camp, home no longer meant what it once did. Many of their cities were gone, bombed to dust. Their houses were ruins, their families scattered. Some had lost husbands or brothers at the front. Others had no one waiting for them. Still, they carried one memory that gave them strength, that meal, that day, when the enemy treated them like people again. When the women were finally released, they were given a small piece of bread, a Red Cross paper, and a train ticket. As they left, a few American guards waved goodbye. One of them called out, "Good luck, ladies," in his rough accent. The women smiled and waved back. On the train home, they talked quietly. "Do you think they meant it?" one asked. "Yes," said the teacher, "they meant it. That's what makes it so hard to forget." Back in Germany, life was not easy. Food was still short. Winters were long and cold. But whenever the women saw American soldiers in the occupied zones, they didn't feel the same fear anymore. Some even worked with them as translators, nurses, or cooks. One of the women later told a local reporter, "I used to think kindness was a trick, but those Americans taught me something, that even in war, people can choose to be good." Another woman kept the small napkin from that Christmas feast. It was old and yellowed, but she refused to throw it away. She said it reminded her that humanity had survived, even when everything else seemed lost. Historians later found records of that day, the menu, the names of the guards, the notes in military reports. It was a small story in the middle of a giant war, but it showed something rare, compassion. In the years that followed, some of those American soldiers and German women exchanged letters, simple notes. "How are you? Are you safe? I remember that Christmas." One letter from a woman named Hilda ended with these words, "You fed us when we had nothing. You made us believe the world could be kind again." For the soldiers, too, that day stayed in memory. Many said it was the first time they truly felt like they were fighting for something more than victory. They were fighting for the idea that mercy was stronger than hate. As the years passed, nations rebuilt, but the story of that Christmas stayed alive in memories, in diaries, and in the quiet words of those who had been there. "This wasn't propaganda," one woman said years later. "It was real. And because it was real, it changed us." Years later, when the war was only a memory, the women still spoke of that one Christmas in the American camp. Some had grown old, their hair silver, their hands lined with age. Yet when they talked about that day, their eyes softened and their voices grew quiet. "It was the first time I felt human again," one said in an interview decades later. "They didn't see us as enemies. They saw us as people." For many of them, that moment changed everything. They began to see that the world was not divided only by flags and uniforms, but by choices, the choice to hate or the choice to show mercy. Historians studying the story later found many similar reports from other camps. American soldiers had shared food, played music, even prayed with their prisoners. Small acts, but powerful ones. In the chaos of war, such moments were rare lights in a dark world. One American chaplain wrote after the war, "We had better weapons, better food, and more freedom. But our greatest strength wasn't power. It was kindness." And that became the truth at the heart of this story. The women who once feared the enemy later told their children and grandchildren about the Americans who fed them. They didn't talk about the hunger or the work or the cold. They talked about that one meal, the warmth, and the song, Silent Night. They wanted the next generation to know that even in war, kindness could survive. This wasn't propaganda, one woman wrote in her diary. It was mercy, simple, human mercy, and it broke every wall inside us. Over time, that small Christmas story came to represent something bigger, a reminder that peace is not built by force alone, but by compassion. Nations can rebuild cities and roads, but healing hearts takes moments like that one, a meal shared between enemies, a song sung in 2 languages, a quiet reminder that we are all human. They had come into the camp as prisoners, defeated, afraid, stripped of dignity, but they left as something else. They left as witnesses to a truth deeper than victory or defeat. As one of them later said, standing before her children many years later, they won the war, but more than that, they won our respect. They had come as conquerors, they left as teachers, and in the end, America's greatest weapon was not its bombs or tanks, it was its mercy.